that?
I think one of the biggest lies we've ever been told is that we're linear beings living a linear life. I now know that we're dimensional beings living a dimensional life. And when the doors of dimension open to us and you have one of those transcendental moments, think about it as a full-on sensory experience without your senses. Now, if we're sitting here and your senses were heightened by 25%, everything you were seeing, everything you were hearing, everything you were smelling, everything you were tasting, your awareness of everything around you would be heightened. Well, awareness is consciousness, and you can't have consciousness without energy. So what happens is you find a person all of a sudden immersed in another dimension. Just a whole different reality that appears more real than this because you're more aware. But their eyes are closed and they're not using their senses. So then there are latent systems in the brain that switch on that cause us to all of a sudden wake up to a greater level of awareness of how reality is, and some veil, some conditioning is removed. We talked about the pineal gland. Tiny little gland, little bigger than a grain of rice. It sits in the limbic brain, the chemical brain, the midbrain. And right next to the pineal gland, there are these two junction centers. They're called thalamus. So you have thalamus on one side, and thalamus on the other side. And it's like a train station. All the fibers from the body, from the spinal cord, come up and attach. They connect like this, and then there's a big ring, and then all the fibers that go up to the other parts of the brain connect there, and there's just can go relay in all different directions. Well, the pineal gland sits right between there. So how are you going to activate that gland? Well, we now know that once you open your heart and you can create a kind of level of love and gratitude, you can begin to open the center. This center is the center of oneness and wholeness. This is our connection to the unified field. In fact, when this center becomes coherent by practice, it begins to produce a measurable magnetic field. And that energy is a frequency, and that frequency causes a change in information we're emitting. So once energy makes it here, it acts as an amplifier to cause more energy to move up into the brain. So now we have more energy going to the brain, so we practice doing that as a community. We do a specific breath, to begin to take all the energy that you use for orgasm, all the energy used to digest a meal and metabolize, all the energy that you use for the stress response and emotional reactions. Instead of those first three centers are energy consumers. We draw from the field. We draw from that field around our body and we turn it into chemistry. We're tapping the life force when we do it. It's a choice. You do it over too much time, you shrink your energy field. Now you're matter trying to change matter. And we tend to feel those emotions and we think equal to how we feel. If you feel like a failure, you think you are a failure. And the more you think you're a failure, the more you feel like a failure. And the repetition of that cycle is taking thought as energy and storing it emotionally in these lower centers. A lot of people have a lot of stuck energy in their body, so the breath is designed to pull that energy up the spine all the way to the brain. Now when we get to the brain, we contract those muscles and we squeeze, and when we do that, we're moving the fluid inside the closed system of the spinal central nervous system, the brain, the skull, the spinal column, the spinal cord. There's fluid in there called cerebrospinal fluid. And as we accelerate that fluid, the fluid is made of proteins and salts in solution, charged molecules. So as you accelerate a charged molecule, you create what's called an inductance field. So as you inhale and you squeeze, you start accelerating these charged molecules, and it begins to cause energy from the body to move up into the brain. Get all the way up, you follow it all the way to the top, and you squeeze like that. The act of compressing that fluid into the back of your brain causes pressure against the pineal gland. And the pineal gland can respond because it has tiny little crystals in it, stacked on top of each other. And when you compress those crystals, you take a mechanical stress and you begin to create an electrical charge. It's called the piezoelectric effect. And so the act of doing it over and over again as you start to compress those crystals begins to electrically charge that system. And now the pineal gland begins to produce a resonant electromagnetic field. And the crystals can only stretch so far, and then the field reverses. And when it reverses, it compresses the crystals again. And now you have a little antenna going on there. Now, when energy finally starts to move to the brain, all of a sudden the sympathetic nervous system switches on, and now your brain goes into what's called gamma brainwave patterns. Very super conscious, super aware state. Now, when you go into gamma, it's the ultimate state. It's the ultimate state of heightened awareness. Now, the type of gamma that we're capturing in our brain research is so far outside of normal not a little outside of normal. Like there's a bell curve where most people exist, like if you were to measure eyesight or height or hearing or liver enzymes, we took 100 people, you would see the same curve. You have most of the people in the normal, then you have a little better, a little worse, and then a lot better and a lot worse. And that makes about 99% of the population. And we could say if you divided it equally, they're called standard deviations. 3 standard deviations above normal, 3 standard deviations below normal makes up 99% of the population, no matter what we're measuring. The measurements we're getting, 200, 300, 400, 500 standard deviations outside of normal. The amount of energy in the brain during that moment is not coming from some thread in the outer environment. It's coming from the energy, the very life force that's stored in the body. Now, when that happens, the pineal gland then begins to release very powerful chemicals that are going to take that frequency the brain is processing and turn it into very profound visual imagery. Melatonin, the nighttime neurotransmitter, gets an upgrade. Now you go lucid. Now your brain becomes more electric. Just the same chemical found in an electric eel. The brain all of a sudden moves into stasis. It releases benzodiazepines, just a sister molecule, which is Valium. The analytical mind is sedated. And now the autonomic nervous system, we see this on our brain scans, is on fire. When that happens, we look at light. The moment our brain perceives light, it sends a signal right to the pineal gland, and the brain starts making serotonin. Serotonin's the daytime neurotransmitter that kind of gets us up. We process beta brainwave patterns. We're aware of our body in space and time. When night comes along, the inhibition of light takes serotonin and turns it into melatonin. Melatonin's kind of a nighttime neurotransmitter. So what I'm saying is that the wavelength of visible light causes us to function in this three-dimensional reality. So then what happens when the pineal gland is activated? Your eyes are closed, and all of a sudden it starts picking up frequencies that are faster than the speed of light. Wavelengths faster than the speed of light. Well, Einstein said E equals mc squared. The ceiling of everything in this three-dimensional reality is the speed of light. Anything that travels faster than the speed of light, matter turns into energy. Now you're going quantum. So what happens then when the pineal gland starts picking up frequencies that are faster than the wavelength of light? Now we're in the quantum. Now that frequency is carrying information, and if the pineal gland, the research shows, is a transducer, it's going to take that frequency that's carrying information and turn it into a profound visual experience. And when it's visual like that, the hallucinogenic chemicals that's created, now you're not just dreaming. Melatonin makes you dream. Now you're really dreaming. Melatonin gets the upgrade, and you go lucid. Those chemicals fit in the same receptor sites, and now you're in the dimension, because that's where all of your awareness is. And this world literally disappears. Now, what's the importance of that? Experience enriches the brain. Experience produces an emotion. And we've seen people, when they hook up to this, have rashes that they've had their entire life disappear. Tumors go away. Well, because the body's getting a biological upgrade. So then we see this crazy switch go on in the brain. And now, right on the top of the head on our brain scans, this area is very, very activated. So energy is moving out as you start to accelerate those charged molecules. You're creating a magnet. You're moving those charged molecules and right to the top of the head, and now it's producing this very powerful electromagnetic field, a torus field. Now, once the pineal gland is signaled, the pineal gland sends a signal right to the pituitary. And now the pituitary has a posterior aspect, and the pituitary begins to release 2 profound chemicals, oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin is the love chemical. Oxytocin signals nitric oxide. Nitric oxide causes the arteries in your heart and lungs, right in this area, to begin to swell. Now you're feeling an incredible love for life, a joy for existence. You are so grateful for the moment. Now, gratitude is the ultimate state of receiving. When you get something, give thanks. The signature means it's already happened emotionally. So once this center swells and you feel grateful, you're in the perfect state to receive. Now there's a reverse field. This field's going this way. Once you feel gratitude, now there's a reverse field, and we see it right in the brain scan, right here. That energy is coming right down into the body, and people say, it was like my body was filled with light. What's that? Why is that important? Because the second chemical is called vasopressin, anti-diuretic hormone. What does that do? It causes the cells to retain water and to swell. So water is the perfect conduit for electricity, for electromagnetism. It needs a medium. So now the cells swell so they can tolerate a greater frequency. And all of a sudden, inside the cell, if you were to take a cell and you were to blow all the snot off the cell, you would be left with these skeletal structures called microtubules. Many scientists call them the seat of consciousness. They're tiny protein filaments, and they vibrate. So all disease is a lowering of frequency, an incoherent message. And if cells, you start to understand cells emit light and information. And when I'm emitting a frequency and you're another cell and you're emitting the same frequency, that frequency, the cell can share information. We're on the same radio station. But when cells are no longer have the light because we're in that survival state, they can't communicate. So now all of a sudden the cell is swollen with water. You're in a state of receiving. That energy is moving right into the body, and those microtubules begin to shimmer in a very coherent, orderly way, because that frequency is a greater degree of oneness and wholeness. It's a greater degree of order. So the cells all of a sudden start vibrating in coherence. The whole body does, and we would describe that as love or wholeness or grace or gratitude. And in that moment, those cells vibrating at the same frequency all of a sudden get a biological upgrade, and they're emitting more light, more coherent information, and all of a sudden the person gets their hearing back, they get their vision back. Because, now this is the great question, you and I, we live by the hormones of stress. When we live by stress, this very stress response causes our senses to be heightened. And we're materialists. We narrow our focus on the cause, the danger, on the threat, on matter. So people become habituated, and all they see is matter in their world. Now, when you start connecting to that field above the speed of light, you have to first become nobody, no one, no thing, nowhere, and no time. You have to take all of your attention off your body, every element in your environment and time. That's the moment in your pure consciousness. We teach our students then as an awareness, as a consciousness. You can't experience the quantum with your senses. It's a realm beyond the senses. It's a realm beyond space and time. To begin to connect to that frequency, to pay attention to it, to stay present with it, to experience it, to surrender to it. And as they begin to connect to it, they start feeling less separation, because the stress hormones create separation. They start feeling more oneness, more wholeness.